On a winter morning in 1994, a man named Fred Boyce was sitting in his car in Massachusetts listening to the radio when a news report came on that made him pull over to the side of the road. A federal committee had just revealed that decades earlier, children at a state institution had been fed radioactive cereal by researchers from one of the most prestigious universities in the world. Boyce sat there, hands on the steering wheel, staring at nothing, because the institution they were talking about was the place where he had spent his childhood. He had been one of those children. He had eaten that cereal. And for more than 40 years, no one had told him what was in the bowl. The story of what happened at the Fernald State School in Waltham, Massachusetts between 1946 and 1953 is one of those stories that sounds like it was invented. It involves the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, one of America's largest cereal companies, the United States Atomic Energy Commission, and roughly 90 boys between the ages of 7 and 17 who were used as human test subjects without their knowledge or consent. They were told they had joined a science club. They were given extra food, trips to baseball games, and Mickey Mouse watches. What they were not told was that the cereal they ate for breakfast had been laced with radioactive isotopes of iron and calcium, so that researchers could track what happened to the nutrients inside their bodies using Geiger counters. To understand how something like this was possible, you have to understand the place where it happened. The Walter E. at our Fernald State School was founded in 1848 under a name that tells you everything you need to know about the era that created it. It was originally called the Experimental School for Teaching and Training Idiotic Children. Later it was renamed the Massachusetts School for the Feeble-Minded, and eventually it was named after its third superintendent, Walter E. Fernald, a man who became one of the leading voices of the American eugenics movement. The purpose of the institution, particularly after Fernald took over, was not primarily education, it was segregation. The idea, which was considered progressive science at the time, was that people deemed genetically inferior needed to be separated from the rest of society so they could not reproduce and pass on their supposedly defective traits. So what most people don't realize is that eugenics did not begin in Nazi Germany. It began in the United States. American scientists and institutions were the pioneers of the movement, and facilities like Fernald were its infrastructure. At state fairs in the 1920s and 1930s, exhibits were set up to teach the public about the benefits of selective breeding in humans. And institutions across the country were filled not just with people who had genuine cognitive disabilities, but with orphans, children from poor families, children who had simply misbehaved, and children who had been abandoned by parents who could not afford to care for them. By some estimates, as many as half the residents of the Fernald School tested within the normal range of intelligence. They were not there because something was wrong with their minds. They were there because something was wrong with their circumstances. Fred Boyce was 8 years old when his foster mother died in 1949, and the state of Massachusetts committed him to Fernald. His records upon admission classified him as a moron, which was an official medical term at the time, used to describe someone who was, in the language of the era, almost normal. His intelligence tests showed he was within the normal range. It didn't matter. He was placed in a dormitory where 36 children slept in beds, pushed so close together there was barely room to walk between them. The children received almost no education. One former resident described the schoolroom as a holding pen, where a child might repeat the first year of reading 5 or 6 times without ever progressing. The staff were overworked and underpaid, and abuse, as physical, sexual and psychological, was documented and widespread. Children who tried to run away were locked in solitary confinement in a basement cell, stripped of their clothes, and left on a thin mattress on the floor behind barred windows. It was into this environment that researchers from MIT arrived in 1949 with a proposal. The lead researcher was a professor named Robert S. Harris, and the study was partially funded by the Quaker Oats Company. To understand why a cereal company was funding nutrition research involving radioactive materials, you need to understand the cereal wars of post-war America. The breakfast cereal industry was booming. Quaker Oats and its main rival, Cream of Wheat, were locked in fierce competition for market dominance. While a series of scientific studies had recently suggested that oats contained high levels of phytate, a naturally occurring acid that could inhibit the absorption of important minerals like iron and calcium. This was a serious commercial problem for Quaker. If parents believed that oatmeal prevented their children from absorbing iron, they would switch to cream of wheat, which was made from farina and didn't have the same issue. Quaker needed science on their side. They needed to prove that oatmeal was nutritionally sound, and they were willing to fund the research to do it. The method MIT chose to answer this question was radioactive tracing. By adding tiny amounts of radioactive iron and calcium to the cereal and milk, researchers could track the nutrients through the digestive system and measure how much the body actually absorbed. It was a legitimate scientific technique, one still used in medicine today. The question was never whether the technique itself was valid. The question was who was being subjected to it and whether they had any idea what was happening. MIT created something they called the Science Club at Fernald. Boys were recruited with promises of special privileges. In a place where daily life was defined by deprivation and monotony, where children sat on wooden benches for hours with their arms folded, and were hit if they unfolded them, the Science Club was irresistible. Members got extra food, they got trips off the school grounds, they got to go to Boston Red Sox games, they got Christmas parties with girls and dancing. Charles Dyer, who was 7 years old when he joined, later recalled that they gave him a Mickey Mouse watch and made him feel special. Another member, Austin LaRock, who was 13, said the researchers told them the club would involve taking vitamins. They took us places here and there, he said. We were young kids. Fred Boyce would later say that life at Fernald was so brutal that he would have volunteered for anything that got him out, even if they had offered him arsenic in exchange for a trip to a ball game. The parents of these children, the ones who could be located, received a letter. The letter came from the school and mentioned that nutritional studies were being conducted in cooperation with MIT. It said the research was designed to help improve the nutrition of the children and to help them in general more efficiently than before. And it mentioned that participation might result in gains in weight and other improvements. What the letter did not mention anywhere was radiation. It did not mention radioactive isotopes. It did not explain that the children would be eating food laced with traces that would expose their bodies to measurable doses of radiation. The letter was structured as an opt-out form, meaning that unless a parent explicitly objected, the school would proceed. Many of the children's parents had long since disappeared from their lives. Some of the boys signed their own consent forms. Austin LaRock later testified that he couldn't read or write at the time he signed his. He did what he was told because that was the only thing he knew how to do. Over the course of the experiments, which ran from roughly 1946 to 1953, the boys ate oatmeal coated with radioactive iron tracers. They drank milk containing radioactive calcium. In a separate experiment, 9 boys were injected directly with radioactive calcium, so researchers could study how calcium moves through the bloodstream and into the bones. The researchers collected the children's blood samples, urine, and stool to measure radiation levels. The results were exactly what Quaker Oats wanted to hear. The studies showed that oatmeal did not significantly inhibit iron absorption, and that when combined with milk, it provided adequate calcium. These findings went directly to Quaker, who used them in their advertising to claim their product was high in iron. The children at Fernald were never told the results. They were never followed up on medically. The researchers published their findings in academic journals where the acknowledgement sections described the boys as willing participants, and then MIT moved on. The experiments might have remained buried forever in those academic papers, if not for a journalist named Scott Allen at the Boston Globe. In December 1993, the United States Department of Energy, under Secretary Hazel O'Leary, launched a broad initiative to declassify records related to Cold War-era radiation experiments on human subjects. Allen found documents in a jumble of boxes in the Fernald School library that detailed what MIT and Quaker Oats had done. The day after Christmas, 1993, he published an article with a headline that ignited a national firestorm. After the article revealed that researchers from two of America's most elite universities had used children classified as mentally deficient as unwitting subjects in radiation experiments funded in part by a cereal company seeking a competitive advantage in the breakfast market. The response was immediate. The United States Senate convened hearings in January 1994. Senator Edward Kennedy, who chaired the Committee on Labor and Human Resources, asked the MIT representatives a question that cut to the heart of the matter. Why hadn't the researchers conducted these experiments on MIT students or on children at private schools? "Aren't you appalled," he said, "that the most vulnerable people in our society, young people 7 and 8 years old in an institution, were the ones selected?" David Lister, MIT's Vice President of Research, tried to minimize the exposure levels, saying the oatmeal experiments had exposed the boys to roughly 170 to 330 millirams of radiation, which he compared to the amount a person receives from natural background radiation in a year. A Massachusetts state panel later concluded that no discernible health effects had resulted from the experiments, but the panel also found that the researchers had violated the children's human rights by failing to obtain genuine informed consent. Congressman Joseph P. Kennedy II examined the letter MIT had sent to parents and called it deceptive at best. The Massachusetts task force that investigated the case concluded that the consent letter failed to provide information that was reasonably necessary for an informed decision to be made. MIT's own research director, Dr. Bertrand Brill, initially tried to defend the choice of subjects by arguing that the Fernald children were ideal because they ate more cereal than most people. Under pressure, he reversed himself. They shouldn't have used a group that had no way to say no, he admitted. That was wrong. In 1995, President Clinton issued a formal apology to the former members of the Fernald Science Club and to subjects of other radiation experiments that had been sponsored or supported by the federal government during the Cold War. His advisory committee ruled that the Fernald experiments were morally troubling, but the government offered no financial compensation. To Fred Boyce, who had spent 11 years in an institution that labeled him a moron and used him as a test subject without his knowledge, the apology without compensation felt like nothing at all. As it was like saying nothing was wrong, he said. In 1997, roughly 30 former Science Club members, most of them now in their 60s and 70s, filed a class action lawsuit against MIT and Quaker Oats seeking $60 million. MIT maintained throughout the proceedings that its researchers had acted properly under the standards of their time. But rather than face a prolonged trial, MIT and Quaker Oats agreed in January 1998 to pay a settlement of $1.85 million. After legal fees, each plaintiff received somewhere between $20,000 and $60,000, depending on the final number of claimants. David Lister compared the total settlement to the cost of tuition for about 20 MIT students. What makes the Fernald story difficult to process is not just what was done, but the layers of institutional indifference that made it possible. The children were selected because they were powerless. They lived in an institution founded on the premise that they were genetically inferior. They had no parents advocating for them, no education that would have allowed them to question what was happening, and no legal framework at the time that required anyone to ask their permission. The Nuremberg Code, which established ethical principles for human experimentation in 1947, existed during the period of these experiments. But it was treated as a set of guidelines for what the Nazis had done, not as something that applied to American researchers at elite universities. The Fernald experiments were not an isolated case. Between 1945 and 1962, other more than 200 to 10,000 American civilians and military personnel were exposed to radiation in government-supported experiments, often without their knowledge or consent. Pregnant women were given radioactive iron drinks at Vanderbilt University to study iron absorption in prenatal care. Prisoners in Oregon and Washington state prisons had their reproductive organs irradiated to study the effects on fertility. Patients at hospitals across the country were injected with plutonium. The Fernald case was just one entry in a long catalogue of Cold War-era human experimentation that treated certain categories of people, the institutionalized, the imprisoned, the poor, the uneducated, as acceptable losses in the pursuit of scientific knowledge. How Fred Boyce spent the rest of his life trying to escape the label that the state of Massachusetts had placed on him when he was 8 years old. After he was released from Fernald at 19, he joined a traveling carnival because it was one of the few places where nobody asked to see a diploma. He eventually bought a house in Norwell, Massachusetts, the only real home he ever had. He became one of the central figures in the fight for recognition and accountability for what had been done at Fernald, not just the radiation experiments, but the entire system of abuse, neglect, and false imprisonment that institutions like it represented. 4 days before he died of colon cancer on May 6, 2006, at the age of 65, the state of Massachusetts officially declared that Fred Boyce was not mentally retarded. And it had taken 57 years for the state to correct a diagnosis that had never been accurate in the first place. The Fernald State School itself continued operating in increasingly reformed conditions until 2014, when its last resident was discharged. The 186-acre campus in Waltham now sits largely abandoned. Some of the buildings have been demolished. Others stand empty, monitored by security cameras and surrounded by no trespassing signs. In April 2025, a 4-alarm fire broke out at the abandoned site, the second fire in less than a year, raising suspicions of arson. The roughly 10,000 former residents who died during their time at institutions like Fernald across Massachusetts are buried in graves marked only with numbers. In November 2025, Massachusetts passed a new law making records from its state institutions accessible for the first time. Advocates say more than 10 million records have been opened. Families who spent years trying to learn what happened to their relatives inside these facilities can now, for the first time, access the documentation. But much has been lost. Records were poorly maintained or destroyed. The full scope of what happened inside these walls, not just the radiation experiments, but the daily reality of life for the children who lived there, may never be fully known. What remains is the question that Senator Kennedy asked in that hearing room in January 1994, a question that no one at MIT or Quaker Oats ever adequately answered. Why these children? The answer, of course, is that they were chosen because they could be chosen. How? Because no one was watching. Because the institution that was supposed to protect them had already decided they were less than fully human. Because in post-war America, at the dawn of the atomic age, technology was good and we were the good guys and anything we did could not be bad. And because a cereal company wanted to prove that oatmeal was as nutritious as the competition, and the cheapest, easiest, most convenient way to prove it was to find a population that couldn't say no, hand them a bowl of cereal with something invisible mixed in, give them a Mickey Mouse watch, and tell them they were special.